One of the worst weeks in the Syrian war as the regime tries to oust rebel forces near the capital. What will be the civilian cost? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the assault on Eastern Ghouta. Activists on the ground call it a doomsday campaign. Both regime and Russian fighter jets have been bombarding the suburb of Eastern Ghouta on the outskirts of Damascus. Hundreds of people have been killed. Critics say that once again, an all-out war is being fought in what's supposed to be a de-escalation zone. Residential areas there have long been cut off from food and medicine. One French diplomat condemned the onslaught, calling it a Middle Ages-style siege. In a moment, we'll debate how it's allowed to happen. But first, Annalise Borges has this exclusive report.
By any measure, the Syrians left in Eastern Ghouta have endured more than what is humanly imaginable. The only thing abundant in this besieged district outside Syria's capital, Damascus, is despair. Last week, the Syrian regime ramped up its assault to retake what is now one of the last remaining rebel-controlled territories. 6 days of relentless bombardment killed nearly 300 people. It was one of the deadliest weeks in Syria since the war began.
People are under the rubble. Civilians, children. What else is there to say? We are tired of talking about this. Everyone can clearly see it. The shelling is exclusively targeting civilians. They can't face fighters, so they come and strike us. If Damascus gets targeted, we get revenge strikes that target us civilians only.
There was no shelter from the shelling. Children were targeted, and when the wounded were taken to hospitals for treatment, medical facilities were bombed too. Death and destruction were everywhere. Eastern Ghouta has been suffering for years. The regime surrounded the district in 2013. Almost nothing has gotten in since, and almost no one gets out. An estimated 400,000 people are trapped inside the enclave and face severe shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies. It has turned into one of the longest and most destructive sieges in recent wars, about a year longer than the one of Sarajevo. Humanitarian agencies have long warned the regime has been pushing Eastern Ghouta to the brink of catastrophe. It all started with peaceful anti-government demonstrations in 2011. But when government forces started killing civilians, people took up arms, and the opposition shattered into 100 pieces. Groups considered terrorist organizations flourished. Major international players got involved. And the crisis escalated into a full-blown war that has claimed more than 400,000 lives and driven millions from their homes.
It's one of the most complex battlefields you can ever imagine. I mean, as soon as you think you can make it this complex, it grows in complexity.
Since the US, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Israel got dragged into the conflict, the stakes have gotten higher. These major military powers have different interests and at times different enemies. And with every troop maneuver, Syria moves further away from peace. Those who are fighting on the ground in Syria are also the ones leading diplomatic attempts to resolve the conflict. The latest surge in violence, which continued in other parts of Syria, including Idlib province, threatens to end what little diplomatic headway has been made so far. That includes the de-escalation agreement brokered by Moscow, Ankara, and Tehran to reduce violence around the country and pave way for peace talks.
Humanitarian diplomacy seems to be totally impotent. We're getting nowhere at the moment.
the diplomatic stalemate is likely to push Syria's war well into its 8th year. For the survivors in Eastern Ghouta, this will mean more thick clouds of smoke that will make it nearly impossible for them to see any hope. Annelies Borges, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now here in Istanbul by Ammar Kaf. He's the Executive Director of the Omran Center for Strategic Studies. And in Moscow, Andrei Afanasyev. He's the host of Zagrad TV. And here in the studio in Istanbul, TRT World's defense analyst Ubay Shahbandar. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Ammar Kaf, let me begin with you. We're seeing trouble in East Ghouta, 400,000 people trapped. That's at least 400,000. Hundreds have been killed. Tell me why it's happening.
Well, I think this question needs to be asked to the regime that has been bombarding the Eastern Ghouta and using chemical weapons. Where are the Russian guarantors? Where are the Iranian supporters or guarantors of the regime? The Syrian people are the recipients of this bombardment, and so the question really is to be asked to especially the Astana, to the governments, the 3 countries that have put the guarantees on the implementation of the deconflicting zone in Eastern Ghouta. This is ridiculous. This is outrageous. What the people of Ghouta have been receiving when they have complied with the cessation of hostilities, with the exiting of all the extremist elements, with all the requirements, but yet the regime has continued to besiege the city to stop the food and medicine from coming in, and lately using chemical weapons in a great push against the United States and the other governments that have stopped against or have voiced their opposition to using chemical weapons.
Right. So
the question here goes back to the guarantors of this peace agreement.
Yeah, and we're hearing from people on the ground that there are airstrikes, missile strikes, cluster bombs, chlorine gas missiles, and napalm. This is what we're hearing on the ground. We can't absolutely confirm this. Andrei, from the Russian perspective, who does Russia think, the Syrian regime, and the Russians are involved as well, who does Russia think they are bombing and besieging right now? Who do they think they're fighting?
First of all, I would like to point out that the source of the information mentioned by my colleague and by you, my colleagues in Istanbul, is based mainly on the reports of the so-called Syrian Observatory for the Human Rights. And it's a UK-based NGO formed out of 1 person, and it has been consequently reporting on Syrian crisis, and mainly the information that this NGO reporting is so-called fake news. I can tell you that it reports also about the Afrin and the situation there, and this NGO says that Turkey is committing crimes there. So
hold on for a second.
I wouldn't trust the
I see where you're going.
in general.
So we're getting from the Damascus Media Center 1,138 airstrikes, 24 cluster bombs, and so on. But forget us. You don't trust us. You don't trust the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. You want to bring up Afrin? That's fine. Let me then bring up the chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry, Paulo Pinheiro, who says, quote, "What is happening in Eastern Ghouta is not simply a humanitarian crisis because aid is denied. These sieges involve the international crimes of indiscriminate bombardment and deliberate starvation of the civilian population." Let's go to France's ambassador to the UN, François Delattre, called for an unhindered access for aid agencies and said, quote, "Eastern Ghouta is experiencing a Middle Ages-style siege. This is totally unacceptable." So the chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry and the French ambassador to the UN, are they also just getting, I don't know, fake information from people with no credibility?
Well, do you really trust in their sources? Have they opened the sources? When you make such kind of accusations, you should give the proven information. And the proven information is that now Syria is still not a peaceful country. And by saying that, I mean, you just distribute the information that's not true. And in this case,
but you are certain, that the French ambassador to the UN and the UN Commission of Inquiry chairperson, they're both wrong and they're getting the wrong information. You're absolutely certain that they're not getting the right information because conveniently it criticizes your side.
Imran, my dear colleague and friend, do you remember how Mr. Colin Powell was having a
Yeah, he was at the UN Security Council and he held that thing. I've heard this before from you, and I've heard it from other Russian guests as well. I'm going to be hearing the story until doomsday. I'm going to be hearing the story until the end of days. Anytime I ask a tough question, I get, didn't you hear about Colin Powell when he held up that thing at the UN Security Council? It's stale. We need to move on. I'm asking you very sincerely.
I have a lot of...
The man from the UN Commission of Inquiry and the French ambassador, are you convinced that their information is fake? And conveniently, you believe it's fake because it criticizes your side in this debate?
Absolutely not. I just tell you that I'm not sure that this information is verified. And Mr. Ambassador has opened his sources and has given the proof to his words. And also, I would like to say that I'm pretty surprised that the position of Turkey, that have been our allies in this conflict and has been really helpful in solving the problem with ISIS and other terrorist groups, is somehow, you're not representing the Turkish government, of course,
no, I'm not.
But I'm really surprised to hear this position from Turkish
I'm not
media.
the Turkish ambassador to Russia, and you're not the Russian ambassador to Turkey. We're not having a diplomatic meeting here.
Definitely
I'm
not.
asking tough questions about what's happening in Eastern Ghouta, and you're defending a position, right? I'm not defending Turkey, I'm not representing Turkey, and I don't expect you to be representing Russia,
Imran,
even though your views represent the Russian
official
official view. I want to bring in Obey Shabander. Obey, where are we? Hold on a second, Andrei, because we've got another guest here. Obey, where are we right now in the situation in Eastern Ghouta? Because we hear that things are dying down generally, but then we see this horrendous humanitarian crisis. Whoever you blame, it's a terrible situation. People are being besieged in Eastern Ghouta, and they're being bombarded in Eastern Ghouta. How bad is it, and why did it get to this point?
Well, Imran, Eastern Ghouta is supposed to be one of the areas of the so-called de-escalation zone, but if you look at the numbers, it is absolutely staggering in terms of the suffering. According to independent medical aid organizations and the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights, around 400,000 civilians are in a besieged area in Eastern Ghouta. Around 100,000 of those civilians are children. Desperate medical aid cannot make it into this besieged area. This area is about 10 miles away from the city center of Damascus. Food is extremely scarce or extremely expensive. People in that area are extremely desperate. And if you look at the numbers that the UN has reported, in just a one-week period in early February, around 300 civilians were injured or killed by airstrikes. And according to the UN report, most of those have been by Assad regime airstrikes and forces allied to the Assad regime, which, of course, as we know, most of the airspace in Syria allied with the Assad regime does belong to the Russian Air Force. So the medical situation and the humanitarian situation that borders on starvation in Ghouta has been as bad as it's ever been since the beginning of the conflict.
Right. Okay, and going back to the beginning, Ammar, might it be plausible that Andrei has a point, and maybe, even though civilians are being killed and being besieged, maybe there are some terribly unpalatable characters within Eastern Ghouta who might be members of extremist groups, and that's why the Syrian regime and the Russians are trying to knock them out, and in the process, they don't care about civilian casualties. Might that be plausible?
Well, allow me to agree a little bit with my Russian colleague that perhaps the Syrian Observatory has exaggerated many stories on the Syrian conflict. However, the local council of Duma, that has no relationship with any armed groups, including the ones in Ghouta, have been bombarded, have been targeted. Other local councils in Eastern Ghouta have been targeted. Blood has one color. Its blood is red. And that doesn't lie. That doesn't create any fake news. Now, if there are elements that are to be targeted, target them. Do not target the areas that are absolutely free of those extremist elements. Killing children, getting almost 57,000 school children out of their schools in the last few days, targeting them with chemical weapons is unacceptable, regardless of whether the news was narrated by the Syrian Observatory or other fake news. At the end of the day, you have lives, you have humans that need to breathe and need to live and have the right to be protected, regardless of who the parties are, regardless of what Russia thinks of the other partners. This is a human right, a basic human right to live and to breathe fresh air and to go to school and to eat and to have medicine. those are basic elements that need to be respected and honored. And so if Russia thinks there are 100 Nusra front still situated in areas within the Eastern Ghouta, there are definitely ways of doing that. There are definitely ways of exterminating, of eliminating those elements. But this is not how to go about it. And if the regime is using the airspace with the acknowledgement of the Russians, and I mean, perhaps the Russians are unwilling to admit that they are incapable and they are out of any leverage over the regime. If they are, then we are really in a very bad situation.
Yeah, Vasily Nebenzia saying, the Russian permanent representative to the UN, saying, we would like to see a ceasefire, the end of the war, but the terrorists, I'm not sure, are in agreement. Let me ask you, Andrei, do you not believe that the situation is that bad on the ground? Or do you think, yes, it is bad, but that the Syrian regime and Russia are right in targeting these people because they are terrorists? Which one is it? Is it not happening, or is it happening, but they're killing bad people?
Imran, I'm a professional journalist, and I trust sources and verified information. So that's the only way to understand what's happening there. And as you know, in any military conflict in any country, both sides of the conflict will use information as an instrument to leverage and to put pressure on each other. So that's the only way to know what's happening there is actually going there. And I invite all of you, my colleagues, to have this panel there in Eastern Ghouta or in Damascus. So in this case, we will be able to have the most precise information about what's happening there. Otherwise, if we are using, Turkish journalists, Russian journalists will be using Western media, quoting some NGOs.
You'd agree.
It's not journalism.
But even with Eastern Ghouta, we've seen, in a way, we've seen this before with Eastern Ghouta when there were reports that these people in 2013 were gassed by Bashar al-Assad. The Russian perspective was they were not gassed by Bashar al-Assad. You could have a UN inquiry, you could have as much evidence to fill up all the mountains of the earth, but that perspective would stay the same because it will say, no, it's the Western media that's saying that chemical weapons were used. This is fake news. So you're saying you're relying on evidence, but I mean, when we look at the track record, evidence doesn't seem to change these positions, does it, Andrei?
Well, we rely only on sources and on common sense and on sanity. So before, as you know, in law schools, they teach that before accusing someone of something, you must, first of all, think about the motives. So what are the motives of official Damascus to bomb his own citizens with chemical weapons, knowing that after that, all the rest of the world
I don't have the time to psychoanalyze Bashar al-Assad. I don't know why 400,000 people were killed. I have no idea. But it happens. As you said, war is ugly, war is terrible.
Bashar al-Assad.
Okay, fair enough. You don't believe he has the motive.
War is terrible, definitely.
7 years on, you don't believe he has the motive. That's fine.
I will believe it.
Okay.
I will believe sources and verified information.
Okay,
I will believe verified information.
We seem to disagree on this, but fair enough. All I'm saying is I can't psychoanalyze Bashar al-Assad. Obey Shahbander, big picture. We have Idlib in the northwest. We have Eastern Ghouta near Damascus. There's trouble. We have Afrin in the north. We have Turkey's Operation Olive Branch. There's still a fight against Daesh on the Iraqi border. All of these things happening is whatever semblance of calm that we had beforehand in Syria unraveling now because we have multiple pockets of conflicts that are connected but not connected as well.
Well, the geopolitical situation has been as complex as it's ever been, despite the gathering of the major countries in the region to try to de-escalate the situation, to reach a political settlement. Syria today is further than it's ever been. We still have remnants of Daesh in the far parts of eastern Syria. The humanitarian situation in major parts of Syria is still as bad as it's ever been, with hospitals being destroyed, with food being scarce. We still have plans by the major powers, but Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the U.S. to push for continued peace talks hosted by the UN in Geneva. But of course, as you know, those haven't really gone anywhere. The Sochi talks didn't really conclude in anything meaningful. So it seems that this conflict is being just litigated on the battlefield, and as always, it's the civilians and those that are most vulnerable to war that are being impacted.
Yeah, and talks set to be hosted in Istanbul as well, as a continuation of the Sochi peace process and the peace talks happening here. Possibly in March, we'll get confirmation of that. Turkey, Russia and Iran will be at the table. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Andre, I appreciate you taking the time to come on the program. Thanks so much. You were a good sport. Ubaisha Bandar and Ammar
You're
Kaf.
welcome.
Thanks again for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead on the Newsmakers, it's been 10 years since Australia apologised to its Indigenous peoples. But has the government backed up the rhetoric with action? And could Duterte end up at The Hague? We ask if an ICC investigation against the Philippine president will stop the killing in his war on drugs. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. For decades, Australia stole Indigenous children from their families to raise them in state care, in a policy that created what's known as the stolen generations. 10 years ago, Parliament apologised. It was a historic moment that raised hopes of national reconciliation. But what's happened in the decades since? New numbers are out that show Indigenous Australians still have shorter lifespans and make up 1/4 of the country's prison population. Meanwhile, there are continued calls for reparations. Here's Natalie Pohonen.
Indigenous Australians are the oldest continuous civilization in the world. Their rich culture stretches back tens of thousands of years. But many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were stripped of their culture by a government policy that removed them from their families and placed them into white foster care. They are known as the stolen generations. In 2008, the Prime Minister offered a formal apology for what he called a blemished chapter in the nation's history.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry.
The apology was hailed as a key step on the path to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. In the same year, an ambitious set of targets was established to close the gap in disadvantage between the two groups. They cover areas including education, employment and health. The government's own report card this year admits it is not on track to reduce the gap in life expectancy. It is not on track to improve school attendance among Indigenous students. And it won't achieve goals for reading and maths or employment rates among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
I can advise the House that 3 of the 7 Closing the Gap targets are on track this year, giving us the most promising result since 2011. The solution to closing the gap rests within the imagination, the ingenuity, the passion and the drive of Indigenous people themselves. Government must be the enabler of this success.
It's now a decade since the national apology and the ambitious plan to improve Indigenous lives was launched. Is it time for a new approach to achieve real equality for Australia's First Peoples? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Canberra by Rod Little, the co-chair of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples. In Sydney, former politician David Oldfield, who's the co-founder of the Conservative One Nation Party. And in Melbourne, human rights lawyer Julian Burnside. I thank you all for joining us. Rod Little, let me begin with you. 10 years on from that apology, has much changed in Australia?
Well, I think not a lot has changed. There is a lot of intention and a lot of healing to be done, and I think there's much more to be done as well. So there's lots of hope and lots of expectations from the Parliament of Australia to do things that would assist with that healing.
Okay, Julian
but
Burnside.
No, not really.
Okay. So interestingly, let me then ask Julian Burnside, do you agree with that? Good intentions, but perhaps not properly fulfilled over the past decade?
I'm not sure I would go as far as to say there are good intentions. The Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was produced by Aboriginal leaders in the centre of Australia last year, 2017, was immediately canned by the government, who realised that as a political issue, Aborigines just don't count. Now, it's a scandal. It's a real stain on Australia's history. We need to get serious about it. I think our intentions need to improve.
But I mean, when Prime Minister Kevin Rudd came out and referred to a shameful national chapter in the country's history where these Indigenous children were forcibly taken away from their families and so on, it was emotional, it was from the heart. A lot of Indigenous Australians said they really appreciated that. So doesn't it, it sounds a little bit disingenuous from you, Julian, to say actually the intentions weren't good.
Oh, the intentions of Kevin Rudd's apology were excellent. And I think the apology really struck a chord which most people would not have expected. But there has not been any great follow-through. I mean, what Kevin Rudd said was exactly right, but it left out the first part of history, which is that Aborigines have a very, very close relationship with the land. They've lived in this country for 60,000 years. 230 years ago, we came in and we took the land from them. And that caused them terrible, terrible harm. We have only in recent years begun to notice that the connection between Aboriginal people and the land is closer, if anything, than the connection between Aboriginal people and their parents or their children. Anyway, having taken the land off them, we redoubled the damage by taking their children from them.
Right.
And that has caused immense harm to Aboriginal people. We have not got a coherent plan to fix the harm.
Okay, so David Oldfield, there's no coherent plan to fix the harm, and the apology wasn't quite the apology that Julian wanted. What do you think?
Well, I don't think that there are very many Aboriginal people that will be happy with anything that's done. There's been a lot of money spent, and there has been a lot of good intention. There's also been a lot of politics over a very, very long period of time. We're talking decades and decades, even in the more recent period of, say, the last 30 years. There has been good intention. There's been a lot of work done. There's been a lot of money spent. But no matter how much of that takes place, there are always going to be Aboriginal people. Hopefully there won't be too many of them that feel this way, but there's always going to be Aboriginal people for whom there will never be enough. I mean, we do face a situation where over a long period of time, Aboriginal people have been sold this scenario where they own the land and we are occupying it. Now, I mean, that in reality is a nonsense. It really is. And Australia today is a very, very expansive and well-coordinated civilisation and is very valuable. The land that was stolen, or we would say colonised, back in 1788 was essentially worthless. Nobody wanted it, I suppose, except for the Aboriginal people themselves.
But why did
they weren't doing anything particularly with it apart from living on it.
Why'd you make those inverted commas when you said stolen? I mean, colonisation is theft, isn't it? I mean, the vast majority of them were killed during this process. Why does it seem to be just a glib sort of throwaway line for you, David?
Well, because for me it was colonisation. And look, you
Imran,
could, perhaps in the context of history, you could say that it was theft.
Finish your point, David, and then Rod can respond.
In the context of history, the same as you could say that the theft of every country has taken place by some group of people at some stage. For goodness sakes, my own ancestors in 1066 crossed the English Channel and took England away from the Saxons. Now, every country at some stage has changed hands pretty much by some group. What has to be understood is that for Aboriginal people to get on and do well in Australia, they need to focus on being Australians like everybody else, rather than
and David, if this program had existed in, say, the 13th century and there were Saxons who were terribly affected by that, we would undoubtedly be having this discussion. Let's go to Rod Little. Rod Little, you want to respond to David?
Yeah, look, I think it's pretty naive to get a history lesson from two, respectful white people. I thought our conversation was about the apology to begin with, but also in recent weeks, closing the gap. 10 years on reflection of little achievement on both accounts. Now, I, for one, am a survivor of a stolen generations. My mother, myself, and my grandmother was taken from our families. And that was I was taken just 6 months after the '67 referendum. So don't presume, any non-Aboriginal people know how I feel and how my families feel about the hurt and the healing that needs to be done. So I think we need to focus on with the question that you posed is about the apology, and that is in the last 10 years, what we had expected to improve and to be working with people, not to make assumptions and assume that we need to get over it and get on with it, because I think that's been totally disrespectful and rude.
Okay, so David, here's a man speaking from the heart and speaking from experience.
Well, Imran, I don't particularly mind whoever that person is from the First Nations thinking it's disrespectful. That's his view. It's not a matter of being disrespectful, it's a matter of facing the facts. And I've had a lot to do with Aboriginal people, and by the way, whoever you are, you always presume that I am white. Well, I'm mostly white, but I'm also part Maori.
David,
and my wife
are we playing a game
is
now?
part American Indian.
Oh, come on, David, are we playing a game here?
So I'm sick of
in
this
the context,
game, this BS.
So David,
we
a couple things here.
This BS game.
Okay, David, a couple things. David, a couple things.
This BS game
in the context of this discussion
against
hey,
non-white.
Okay, David.
I'm about as much Maori as most Aborigines are Aboriginal.
Okay, so for the context of this discussion, you yourself said we colonized Australia. You're a white man in the context of this discussion. Secondly, his name is Rod Little. Rod Little is talking to you, and I think it would probably be the respectful thing to, I guess, just, acknowledge his existence for the sake of this discussion. For the context of this discussion, you're a white man, and his name is Rod Little.
Sadly, I didn't get his name at the beginning of this because I can't hear you very well, I'm afraid.
Okay.
But sorry, go on.
Okay, so he's saying that the Indigenous peoples of Australia are not included in this discussion. And you're saying they're just ungrateful because you're giving them everything, and there's no level of amount of things that you can give them that will make them happy. Don't you feel a little bit ashamed of yourself? Because here's a man saying, hey, I'm a part of the conversation here. We haven't done enough, and we're not meeting these targets. So please, let's have this discussion.
The difficulty is that Aboriginal people keep separating themselves, and it's not really their fault. A lot of white people get involved in this, and they separate Aboriginal people from everybody else. Aboriginal people need to get on with being Australians and not be too fussed about being Aboriginal. We need to be a country that is moving the same direction altogether. Now, I don't blame Aboriginal people for that circumstance because they're largely misled by so-called well-meaning white people who are not helping anybody. There's been lots of money spent, there's been lots of politics, there's been lots of talk, but the bottom line is Aboriginal people themselves need to engage in getting on with their lives and doing things for themselves.
Let me ask
the
Julian.
Same as every other Australian has to get up every day and do things for themselves.
So there was some shade thrown at Julian there. Let me ask you, Julian, how you feel about the notion that you're a so-called well-meaning white person misleading Aboriginal people by trying to, I guess, speak up for them.
I don't know that Julian is that. I don't even know Julian.
I am a white person.
I'm not suggesting he is that at all.
No. And I do hope I'm well-meaning. I'd rather be well-meaning than ill-meaning. I don't know where that places David Oldfield. Yes. Incidentally, can I go back one step, Imran? I thought the apology was terrific. Unfortunately, the country has not implemented anything to follow through what the apology might have seemed to promise. The reason I made my point earlier about us taking the land from them, which is a historic fact, and taking their children from them, which is a historic fact, the point about that is that caused them immense harm. And governments come along and they have programs that will last a couple of years. And as David Oldfield has pointed out a number of times, a lot of money's been spent, but it's been spent on short, quick fixes. What we need is a government that will say, we recognise that there are generations of very, very seriously damaged Aboriginal people. We were part of the problem and we are going to spend a generation addressing the problem. I mean, at the moment, the fact is that proportionally, Aborigines are the most incarcerated people in the world. their children are disproportionately alienated from their families. Now, is it possible that what we have done to them is part of the cause of that? We need to stand back and address that sort of question and do it respectfully, but we need to make genuine attempts to restore the position in society which Aborigines are capable of occupying. They represent 600,000 members of our community. David Oldfield wants them all just to become Australian. That's all very well and good, but let's fix up the damage which we caused.
And as we look forward, Rod Little, the metrics don't look good, as Julian had mentioned, right? So poverty rates, incarceration rates, and so on. So we have these close the gap targets from the government. The government itself is admitting that it's not meeting those targets. Tell me how you would actually fix those problems. Is it, I don't know, reparations? Is it some other form of compensation? How do you actually close that gap without, I guess, the white majority feeling they're being trampled upon in some way?
Yeah, look, I really appreciate Julian's sort of capturing of that and reflecting on the efforts, and also David, of the investment. But it's not always about the money. It is about how do others let go and enable us, because we are growing sophisticated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Our intelligence is probably, in a lot of cases, from lessons learned on how to do things. There is, as I said about privilege earlier, there is a perception that non-Aboriginal people need to do things for us and to us, which is a problem of the past, and that is thing. So the cycle of politics and the cycle of governments always change, but Aboriginal people, all Australians, to emphasise that point, that live in poverty and are not having sufficient housing. So their fundamental human rights are being violated across the board. Now, we as Aboriginal peoples and other peoples of the world have fundamental rights to a nationality. Australian is not a nationality. We want identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, like First Nations peoples around the world. Now that is a fundamental right. The other thing is that we, as Julian has pointed out, there has been successive governments. You know, since 1967, we've had over a dozen prime ministers and something close to 21 ministers for Indigenous affairs. Now, you think that over that period of time, in 50 years, that we might have got something right, or if there was an acknowledgement that, gee, we've got the wrong approach here, but it's the rhetoric of the approach and what we've put, you know, with this report in the last the last day or so, saying that there's been a turnaround in 12 months where we're back on track. But there's 10 years, of failure. So the 10-year-old born today is looking towards another 10 years of something that's going to be looking like the same approach. What we're proposing, that there is a very clear partnership. And look, again, I've got to agree with you, Julian, the inaction from the very beginning, from the apology, and let's not forget the Close the Gap Steering Committee, which also is made up of non-Indigenous professionals across the sector. And, you know, again, there's failings there. So we've got to come at it a different approach. And that's what we're proposing.
And you've
leading,
listed
and governments and officials listening.
Yeah, and you've proposed a list of things here, kind of holistically. David Oldfield, a lot of this is sort of folded into people wanting to change the date when they want to change Australia Day, and just a general trend of momentum of people wanting to listen more to the concerns of the Indigenous peoples of Australia. What's so wrong about that?
There's nothing wrong with anybody having input, but of course the input has to have meaning and context. And you know, when it comes to changing the date of Australia Day and all these sorts of things, I mean, that's tinkering around the edges. It doesn't put another Australian, I should say, doesn't put another Aboriginal Australian in a job. It doesn't take another Aboriginal Australian out of a jail or take another one out of a hospital or give anybody better care. You know, I've seen a lot of young Aboriginal children doing very well in one or two schools that are doing a great job in outback Australia. But messing around with dates and messing around with wanting to have a nationality when they don't feel themselves Australian and these sorts of things. I mean, I was horrified to hear a moment ago when it was suggested that Aborigines want their own identity. Well, Aborigines seem more than happy to take the money of the Australian taxpayer, but what are you suggesting? They don't want to be Australians. This is Australia. If somebody doesn't want to be in Australia and doesn't want to be an Australian, then leave.
Well, just a reminder. Just a reminder. They were there. They were there at the very beginning. They were there at the very beginning. Rod Little, final response from you.
Well, but Imran, they weren't there at the very beginning.
Where were they?
Vastly many years ago, ancestors were here. Their ancestors were here. No Aboriginal person living in Australia realistically has any more rights than any other person, be Aboriginal or not.
Okay.
Whether you came here 5 years ago from Turkey and you're now a citizen, you should have the same rights as an Aboriginal person who can trace his family back
we can go back
100 years.
Okay, we can go as far back as Pangea.
I mean, Australians into different people.
Okay, this is interesting because we could go back as far back as Pangea. Nobody comes from anywhere, really. Rod Little, final response from you because we're running out of time.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing. That's the other thing anyway. The Australians, Aborigines didn't come from Australia. They arrived in Australia earlier than other people, at the same time as people arrived in New Guinea. But, you know, those are things that are just anthropological matters. If Australian Aborigines want to improve matters for themselves, they have to do a fair bit more for themselves.
Your concerns, Rod, are anthropological. Get over it and get on with your lives. That's basically what David's saying. Go ahead, respond, Rod.
Well, that's what I'm saying to David. Exactly the same. Get over it, get yourself educated, and then have a listen. Sit down and have a listen to us, because where your point of view and your world view comes from a central, prejudiced world view. And I think I'll leave it there.
Appreciate you taking the time to come onto the Newsmakers.
Thank
I've got
you,
a wrap.
Julian.
Rod Little, Julian Burnside, and David Oldfield. Thanks again.
The preliminary examination of the situation in the Philippines will analyze crimes allegedly committed in this state party. It has been alleged that since July 2016, thousands of persons have been killed for reasons related to their alleged involvement in illegal drug use or dealing.
Defiant in the face of an international criminal court investigation, President Rodrigo Duterte says he will not stop his war against illegal drugs. Duterte faces an official complaint against him and 11 senior officials of mass murder. But in a speech on Monday night, he said he was willing to be jailed, even executed. Well, the director of President Duterte's legal team joins me now. Maricel Seno, thanks for being here. Good to talk to you. You're the right person to talk to right now. The ICC is looking into your president. Are you worried?
No, we are confident that the preliminary examination will reveal that there are no crimes against humanity, as well as that the jurisdiction should actually rest with the Philippine courts and not with the ICC.
Right. Well, I mean, you've signed up to the Rome Statute, so you've agreed to play by those rules. And when you have a complaint, they have to look into it. So do you accept that they have a right to look into it, that they're objective and impartial, and that whatever they come out with will be fair?
Of course, we signed up to the Rome Statute, and we are confident that during the preliminary examination, which I might add is not yet an investigation, it's actually the phase where they will determine if there is reasonable basis to launch an investigation. And we're confident that during the preliminary examination, it will show that the jurisdiction that the court will not have jurisdiction, and that the Philippines should actually be looking into these things, and are in fact actually there are some ongoing investigations in the Philippines regarding the alleged killings. And so therefore the court, as a court of last resort, should not actually acquire jurisdiction over it, and there should be no preliminary investigation.
When people look at the track record of the president since he came to power, undoubtedly a very, very popular man with a popular mandate to clean up the Philippines. But Human Rights Watch says 12,000 people have been killed. And we look at his own words when he vowed to pardon officers convicted of drug killings, when he himself gives the impression that it's a shoot first, ask questions later situation. would you accept that there's enough to work with there for international institutions to want to look into this?
Well, this assessment is up to the ICC prosecutor. The president firmly believes that the war on drugs is a valid exercise of our sovereign powers, and that there are no crimes against humanity with respect to the incidents that have happened. So we leave it up to the ICC prosecutor, but we will be fully participating, and the president actually welcomes the opportunity to be heard on this because he's sick and tired of being accused of crimes against humanity. And so we are going to cooperate with the ICC, and we hope that by signing and ratifying the statute, that we will be given an opportunity to be able to present our case.
Yeah, when he said on Monday night, he said he could not be prosecuted for orchestrating extrajudicial killings attributed to the drug war, saying the crime doesn't exist in the country's penal laws. You're saying you want him, if any legal jurisdiction exists, it should be within the Philippines, but he's saying it's not in our laws, and he says there is no, I can't say this word on TV, effing provision on extrajudicial killing. It is not defined anywhere. So you're saying if anybody's going to look into it, it should be in the Filipino legal system, and the president's saying, well, in our legal system, there's no such thing as extrajudicial killing, so nobody has a case. Would you accept that this is why people are worried?
Well, let me clarify. Extrajudicial killings by itself can constitute murder under our legal system and can also constitute crimes against humanity under our legal system. We actually have a law which actually predates our ratifying the ICC statute, which is almost completely identical to the Rome statute. So if ever there is to be an indictment, that it should be under those laws.
So he was wrong.
No, extrajudicial killings per se, this basically only exists in our administrative laws. They do not exist under our criminal law, but the killings can constitute murder or they can constitute crimes against humanity. I think that may have been the misunderstanding.
Okay. As somebody involved in the law, do you accept as a principle that you could commit unspeakable crimes in the name of a legitimate cause? Because earlier on you said, listen, you know, even the ICC supports the fact that there's a war on drugs. Everybody wants the war on drugs. Everybody wants people not to be drug addicts. They don't want gangs to kill innocent people and so on. That's fair enough. That's righteous. But do you accept as a legal principle that just because that might be a righteous goal, it doesn't preclude the fact that the Filipino authorities could be doing terrible things to get to that end goal?
Okay, so the acts have to be judged as they are. So we believe that the acts are legal. But if the acts constitute as illegal acts, then they can be crimes. But again, these assessments are all up to the ICC prosecutor at this point in the preliminary examination.
Can we park off the ICC for a second? Because I feel it would be remiss of me not to talk about something that the president said on February 7th, addressing former rebels in Malacanang. My apologies if my pronunciation is not right. And I'm going to quote him now.
It's correct.
He said, they will say, okay, how many people are dead? 3, what? 3, son of a bitch, don't lose. Are there any women holding guns? Sir, she's a fighter, an Amazon. Shoot them in the vagina. Tell the soldiers, there's a new order coming from the mayor. We won't kill you. We will just shoot your vagina so that if there are no vagina, it would be useless. This, from GMA, I think I've got an accurate translation there. Is that acceptable? Does that create the type of atmosphere you want to defend? Is this the type of thing you want to defend when it comes to your president and the type of approach he takes to people he deems worthy of killing?
With respect to the New People's Army and the CPP-NPA, at this point, we consider them enemy combatants. So under international humanitarian law, the country, the state, if it is at war with an organized armed group, has the right to kill enemy combatants. So whatever it is that whatever words the president may have used, the act of the killing of combatants, may they be male or female, is legal under international humanitarian law.
So just to be absolutely clear, because they are enemy combatants, shooting them in the vagina is legal and justified?
Shooting them anywhere is legal and justified.
Okay. And would you accept that from the outside looking in, some people might be a little bit nervous about President Duterte when they hear him say things like this?
Perhaps, but as you very well mentioned, the president is a very popular president, and it seems that all of his policies, especially with respect to the national security of the country, is resonating to the Filipino people.
Okay.
So as far as he is concerned, that is what is important.
Okay. Human Rights Watch says those comments encourage state forces to commit sexual violence during armed conflict, which is a violation of international humanitarian law. I'm presuming you don't see it as committing sexual violence.
No, that might be too far off. The statement concerned shooting, not committing sexual violence or committing acts of sexual violence.
Do you think he misspoke? Do you think he could have chosen better words?
That is not. I can't speak for the president in this case. Yeah. So these are his words, and he should be judged for them if he needs to be judged.
Maricel Seno, I hope you'll come back onto the program because I think this was an important conversation to have. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Kim Jong-un's sister may have departed Pyeongchang's Winter Olympics, but did she leave with a gold medal in diplomacy? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.